Hi, my name is Mahala Lahvis, and I'm presenting today on our research called Understanding Differences in Seasonal Variation by U.S. State, Applications of the Falcon Curve. This is research that I've worked on along with Shivani Parikh, Dr. Jonathan Bunicor, Zainab Magavi, Dr. Parishar Salimi-Fard, and Dr. Joseph Allen at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health in the Environmental Health Department. Building electrification is an essential component of full economy decarbonization pathways. The building sector is a major contributor of greenhouse gas emissions and air pollution through both consumption of electricity generated from the electrical grid and through direct on-site combustion of fossil fuels for energy. The building sector was directly responsible for approximately 13% of the total greenhouse gas emissions estimate for 2020, accounting for approximately 778 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent. The public health damages are enormous as well, as the mortality burden estimate from residential and commercial buildings alone in the US was between 26,000 and 34,900 deaths in 2017. And full conversion from combustion-based oil and natural gas energy sources to electric energy sources can, if electrification is met with renewable non-combustion energy, avert environmental and public health risks by promoting cleaner air, healthier people, energy security, and economic growth. Currently, most decarbonization pathway models that guide full economy decarbonization policies in the US are based on yearly variation in energy demand. They do not explicitly include seasonal variation in energy demand caused by increased heating demand in the winter and cooling demand in the summer. And by overlooking the seasonal variation of energy demand, states primarily rely on transmission and distribution from offsite underground gas storage and liquefied natural gas facilities during the peak seasonal demand. Previous work by Dr. Bunicor and others evaluated these seasonal fluctuations in total building energy demand across the US, revealing both the current performance of the energy system under fossil fuels as well as the potential performance of the energy system under various electrification scenarios. His research produced the first Falcon curve to represent seasonal variation at the national level, which pays homage to the famous duck curve. Bunicor and others evaluated how the use of different electric heating technologies with different coefficients of performance, also known as COPs, where higher COPs represent higher efficiencies, could change electricity demand. They found that utilizing heating technologies with a COP of 6 would shrink the current energy demand during the winter peak, offering a feasible option for full economy decarbonization, as the envisioned winter demand would be much more manageable. So while previous work was at the national level, here we aim to apply this method to the state level. For each state has different building electrification needs based on their respective climates and infrastructures and policies. Specifically, this study will be the first to evaluate state-specific seasonal fluctuations in building energy demand and how this state-specific building energy demand would change under various building electrification scenarios. For our methods, we downloaded data from the EIA from March 2010 through February 2020. We specifically pulled monthly data on total energy consumption, natural gas consumption, and electricity generation and consumption by residential and commercial buildings across Massachusetts, Oregon, Florida, and Minnesota. We chose these 4 states because of the variety of climates and infrastructure, as each respective state is located in a different climate region. We then separately calculated descriptive statistics for commercial and residential buildings across each state, including the month-to-month average over these 10 years. We then used state-specific Falcon curves as a basis for assessing how each state's respective energy demand performance would change if different candidate electric heating technologies with different prototypical COPs were implemented. So we use COPs 1 through 6 to represent various electric heating technologies for our electrification scenarios, with COP 1 electric heating technologies representing baseboard resistance heating, COP 2 as air source heat pumps, COP 4 as ground source heat pumps, and COP 6 as utility scale networked ground source heat pumps. So this slide shows the current average monthly energy demand in each state, starting with just Massachusetts here. The y-axis is energy use. On the left side, it's in trillion BTUs. The x-axis is the month starting with January and going through December. The blue is electricity, which we can see is much higher in the summer with a little peak from cooling. And the green color represents fossil fuel, which we can see is much higher in the cooler months for heating. The yellow is electrical system direct use and transmission and distribution losses. We can now see all 4 states. It's important to note the scales here. Massachusetts and Minnesota both go up to 60 trillion BTUs. Florida, the scale goes up to 75, and Oregon goes up to 30. We can see that Minnesota and Massachusetts have similar extreme seasonal fluctuations in energy demand, as they have similar extreme seasonal fluctuations in their climates. And at the same time, Minnesota and Massachusetts have old infrastructure where the majority of buildings were constructed before the 1940s, meaning their building operations are heavily reliant on the fossil fuel system. We can see that Florida uses a large amount of electricity year-round with a high peak in the summer as opposed to the winter. Florida experiences subtropical climates, which necessitate little demand for heating during winter, but extreme demand for cooling during summer. And Oregon experiences a range of continental and Mediterranean climates, and thus has only moderate seasonal demand for heating and cooling during the winter and summer. Oregon and Florida buildings are also more reliant on the electric system and have a lesser need for heating, particularly due to their newer infrastructures, where the majority of their buildings were constructed during the 1970s and 1980s. So we're going to dive into all of the electrification scenarios in a second, but this shows if each state were to convert their fossil fuel use to electricity with a performance of COP1. This is what the seasonal variation curves would look like. None of the y-axes have changed, and their seasonal variation is still very drastic. But if we see much more efficient technologies implemented, we would see these curves, which are much easier to manage. So this shows the other end of the spectrum, what state falcons would look like if they converted all of their fossil fuel use to electricity with a performance of COP6. We can see that if full electrification happened using higher performing technologies, the energy demand during the peak months decreases and becomes much more manageable for states. So the implementation of COP6 technologies would be the optimal scenario for Massachusetts, Oregon, and Minnesota, but for Florida, it actually was not the most optimal. So in this presentation, we're just going to be doing a deeper dive into the 5 electrification scenarios in Massachusetts because we're here. The first scenario is energy demand with 50% of the existing building fossil fuel use converted to electricity with a performance of COP1. The green represents the remaining fossil fuel, the yellow is electricity, and the purple is new electricity in the scenario. The next figure shows energy demand with all of the fossil fuel use converted to electricity with COP1, and towards the right, it goes up to COP6. There's an enormous seasonal fluctuation of 2.8 times if current fossil fuel use is met with COP1 electric heating technologies. This variation starts to flatten as you shift to the right. If current fossil fuel use is met with more efficient electric heating technologies, reducing to a 1.6 times by the COP6. So even with COP2 performance, which is that figure in the middle, the electricity demand in the winter is almost double if you convert on-site combustion for heating to electric heating. In meeting the proposed increased seasonal demand on the electrical grid would require a massive deployment of non-combustion renewables. So Massachusetts stands out in a few ways. It obviously has a volatile climate, really old infrastructure. It is far from a distribution center for oil and gas. So therefore, what Massachusetts needs to do and is doing is implement a really aggressive set of policies that require the state to deploy expensive, highly efficient technologies. Massachusetts actually plans to break ground on several projects to implement geothermal microgrids that perform at COP6 through 8 in the coming years. So while the implementation of each of these technology categories is feasible, Their actual implementation will be a matter of how much time and money and resources each state is willing to invest in upfront to see cost savings in the long term. I do want to point out that these needs are different from the needs of, let's say, Florida, which is already fairly electrified and already has pretty new infrastructure, meaning it would need less expensive technologies to achieve the same gains. Here's our list of limitations. Our analysis was limited to the years between 2010 and 2020. Our data was not comprehensively disaggregated by energy type. We assume that full conversion from fossil fuels to electricity is possible in buildings. We assume prototypical COP values for benchmarking purposes, which does not reflect changing COP values from daily, monthly, and spatial variations of temperatures. We did not include an analysis of how each state supplies its network of energy grids and electrical grids, or how that supply would change under our electrification scenarios, which is a really important part of future research. We can't decarbonize buildings if we're electrifying them without supplying the grid with non-combustion renewables. If we do meet the proposed increased seasonal demand on the electrical grid with fossil fuels, then we would be essentially decarbonizing buildings by recarbonizing the electrical grid, negating the climate, health, and equity benefits of decarbonizing buildings in the first place. So here are our conclusions. This research shows that state-based seasonal variation represented by Falcon curves is an important consideration for energy decarbonization pathway modeling. These Falcon curves can be leveraged to guide statewide or national decarbonization strategies, like assessing the cost benefits of implementing specific decarbonization strategies. So with that, thank you so much for your time.